All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our live webinar. We'll be talking about cyber supply chain and risk management today. I'm Long Lee, CEO of Fix Solutions, and joining me is Kevin Hyde, President of Layer 8 Security.
Good morning, all.
Over, good morning. Over the next 45 minutes, we're going to go through and help you understand how to safeguard your organization from vulnerabilities, introduce you through your vendor software, and also third-party systems. With that, I'll pass it on to Kevin.
Thanks, Long, and good to be with everybody here. There are a lot of examples over the course of the years where the vendors have been the weak point in a cyber attack. We have countless stories and that we'll demonstrate over the next course of a few minutes here while we go through this conversation, where you can button down your organization as much as you can, but the more vendors and the more people you use to conduct your business's operations, the more attack surface you have. So we're going to talk about how that impacts your risk management, your IT, what applications you use, who you can work with, how you can share information. The absence of having a cyber risk management supply chain program, really, or TPRM, depending on what people call it, third-party risk management, is not having one really creates blind spots that cyber criminals, regulators, and the operational failures can exploit. It could be something where you're not patching enough, you don't have the right, maybe you don't have the right IT staff, maybe you have an application that's not operating properly. It jeopardizes your organization's security and compliance and overall resilience. A well-rounded program aligns your organization's risk, posture, and appetite, and integrates with the broader enterprise's risk management efforts, which involves trainings, policies, programs, which third-party software you're willing to use. So we're gonna peel that onion back. We're gonna talk through all that. And then, during the whole course of the conversation, we would definitely love for you to ask questions throughout. Long and I will throw it back and forth to each other, but we obviously would love to have an active conversation as much as we can. So, when we say, cyber supply chain risks, and what are the key aspects? Internal and external risks. When we bring up the idea of and I'm going to use an old example here. Target. We all know in 2013, Target was breached. This is an old, but a watershed moment, and it's worth repeating here. Target, Fortune 500 company, big retailer, lots of credit card information, employee information, vendors all over the world. They were in November of 2013. They had a breach where credit card data was stolen on millions and millions of customers. And at the time, credit card data, it's still valuable. It was even more valuable 12 years ago. But what happened was the HVAC vendor that they used, one of them, out of central Pennsylvania, of all places, was the source of the breach. So Target had Mandiant, it had FireEye, it had IT processes in place, a huge IT staff, IT security, and cybersecurity processes, but the processes weren't being followed. The technology wasn't being monitored, and the HVAC vendors' capabilities that they were connected with the main target IT infrastructure through their permissions. The hackers were able to traverse across the network and get into the payment card system, which should never have happened. It should never have been allowed, but the system wasn't configured correctly. They weren't aware of how many vendors they had in their system. They weren't aware of what the vendors had access to because they weren't set up properly. Having that process working properly is what having a secure cyber supply chain looks like. They had a lot of internal processes that weren't working, and they had an external party in the HVAC vendor that wasn't doing their part either. So it was a failure of both parts. This is where we want to work on companies getting themselves in the right mindset. One myth I want to bust, and then I want to hit Long up to talk about this too. Small companies are just as big a cyber attack target as big companies. Hackers and cyber criminal groups, nation states, they use small companies in order to rehearse attacks for bigger companies. So I come from the Marine Corps. I come from a Marine Corps officer background, and before we go into any operation, we rehearse and we rehearse and we rehearse again. Well, cyber criminal groups do the same thing. They use small companies to rehearse their attacks, and those small companies are often the vendors for bigger organizations. We want to make sure that small companies, middle and large enterprise all think of themselves as they all have attack surface, they all need to button it down, and their vendor community is a big part of it. So as we're setting the stage here, Long, I just want to throw it up to you to talk a little bit about some of your points here as well.
Sure, no, 100%. Even though this incident happened over 10 years, no, 12 years ago now, it still holds true, where now you have AI, right? It's more they're much more advanced in the way they're coming in and attacking. And so it's really one of those things where do you know who your vendors are, right? Because like Kevin was saying, it's small companies out there that you don't think of anything, right? Like, the HVAC company. Well, what are they going to do, right? You don't think of it, but that's where their security postures matter because once they get into your environment, look what happened, right? And so that it's
Mhm.
one of the things where that's the question is when's the last time you checked which vendors have access or if they've gone, they don't work anymore in your system. Are they still there? Are they still active? So those are the kind of questions you never ask. And when's the last time you've done some internal process? A lot of companies don't know.
Yep. Talking about unknowns too. There's an old Donald Rumsfeldism. He was the Secretary of Defense many years ago. And when Operation Enduring Freedom first kicked off in the fall of 2001, there was a press conference he gave. He talked about the known knowns. He talked about the unknown knowns, talked about the unknown unknowns, and the media kind of had a field day with it. But from an intelligence standpoint, that's an accurate representation of how we want to look at things that can cause risk. A known known is like saying, I know that my USB stick policy in my company means that our laptops won't talk to USB sticks, and we've identified that as a risk, and we turn that off. But if suddenly you have a vendor that wants to work with you and they want to transfer data via USB, you have to say, we don't use that. We have to come up with another way to share some data. When if that was a part of a contractual obligation that you had to allow that, then that's how you start to get legal involved. And we're going to talk about key players in a minute here. But part of the security threats here, your risks come from a number of avenues, and they all look friendly, unfortunately. But your vendors that you use in order to conduct, and you might be the vendor or you might have the vendor, whichever side of the coin you're on, and most people are on both. Um, you're going to have a probably a contract, a master services agreement, or something in your terms and conditions that might dictate how you can share data. But if you don't, you might want to start thinking about that because your access that you give to a vendor, the data you have to share with them, what are they going to do with it? What kind of security posture do they have? Partially, part of my job when I was at Cyber Command was going to small foreign nations to assess how do they share data and what do they do with it and how do they protect it, because some of these small foreign nations were still using Yahoo as their email, like where are the tags parked, it was in Yahoo. So that's a problem, right? So we had to understand how do we share data with them, how do we set up their posture correctly so that we are confident that they're going to handle it responsibly. Your contracts are a lot of what dictate at least the least common denominator of what you need to be doing. We see more and more people don't want to have a cyber risk, in their profile. But what they don't know is, well, what level should I raise it up to? It's hard to dictate that and to budget for it when you don't really know what the threats are. Having some risk assessment done on yourself, testing your own company, whether it's through penetration testing, information security assessments, even the insurance questionnaires tend to raise a lot of this to the top. These are the types of vehicles you can use to say the least, we need to have at least this amount of data security. We need these physical controls, these technical controls, these administrative policies based on what our contracts tell us we need to do. And that's where you can at least start a baseline.
Yeah, and the consequences too, right, Kevin? Like, what happens when you have a data breach, operational disruption, right? legal exposure,
Mhm.
and all the brand damage, right? Because like you have your reputation out there that you've worked hard to have established, and then all of a sudden something like this happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all affects that. Yeah.
Does. Yeah, the reputational damage is big, big, big time. Unfortunately, none of us are so unique in what we do that someone can't go somewhere else. And if you have had a data breach that really took you out, that's a problem. And you might have clients that want to go elsewhere. The reality is, at some point, everyone will deal with this. It's not a matter of if, but when. But we're not preaching, immunity from cyber attack. We are preaching resilience. So as we think about this third party risk, we want to think about resilient matters. Um, if someone were to get into your system, do you have security monitoring where you can track them down? Do you have a team that understands what your actual, vulnerabilities are? Not just a vulnerability that Microsoft says, oh, here's a vulnerability. That may not affect you, but what does? And so knowing where you begin and end and where your vendors add on to that attack surface.
Yep. And it falls right into like the potential impacts of this that we were just talking about.
Mhm.
Financial loss is a big one, right? Because it stops whatever payment systems or you're collecting. It can go into legal, exposure. It's if it goes unnoticed, the damage is already done. And that's the problem with it. Because like, when's the last time, when a vendor does have an incident, do they let you know, like, that there's something happening? They have to make sure that, they notify you. We found out like the studies found that 59% of the companies have had a third party breach, and
Mhm.
only about 16% of them monitor them effectively. So it's a very like something that happens, unnoticed all the time. And part of it is that you're underestimating this or underinvesting, like you said, into this whole becoming resilient about it. And because of the um, trusted tools or updates, or you're relying on third parties to do all this stuff. And if you don't ask the right questions, then how do you know? And these companies, like like you're saying, SolarWinds is an example of a big company that happened right with their Move It breach. This caused like this is a platform that a lot of companies are using, right? And it had a global ripple effect when it happened. And so you have to make sure that you kind of have to stop and think of like, at its core, what are my cybersecurity issues? You know, um, do you know which vendors have access to what part of your system? Right? You have to ask those questions. Or if a vendor goes offline, do you have a plan?
Mhm.
What do I do? Like, if they're done, what's your incident response plan or anything with backup disaster recovery? And so, do you have all your vendors a list in one place, or is it scattered somewhere? It's in QuickBooks somewhere. I don't know. Like we know we use somebody.
I'll share a brief example. Well, actually, I have two brief examples I can share. If you want to go back to slide 5 for me, Long. One of the potential impacts here, the SEC decided in 2022 to enact basically a rule where if you're a publicly traded company and you have a data breach, you have to disclose it within days. I think it's 4 days. You have to disclose it within 4 days, the impacts, what happened, how it happened, and it has to be public. So part of the reason is the cyber attacks affect shareholder value, investor value, your stock price. Um, they want to know, they want to disclose. They don't want these companies sitting on it for months and months and holding on to it, and then letting shareholders dump their stock before they make the announcement about it. They're basically clamped down on that. The SEC took notice of that, and this is partially what they put in place. Your vendors are one of the biggest avenues of approach for an attack. So they basically found out that people can muddle with the system, and they put some mitigations in place to stop that. The other one is the European privacy law, GDPR. GDPR basically means that you have to know, and we'll talk a little more about this, but you have to know more about your data, where it's at. And the GDPR was a big shot across the bow. It went into effect in 2018. That's another area where you had to know more about your network as well, based on who has access to your customer data and your marketing data. And we'll delve into a little bit of that later on, but I wanted to bring those up as two big watershed moments for the legal and regulatory impact on how you have to look at your third party supply chain.
Yep.
And one of the biggest things that people ask, and we get asked this a lot of the times when we're working with a company, we might start off with like a risk assessment that might be framework based off of what they do. Like if they're going to be working with they're a defense contractor, they need to be compliant with the NIST framework. If you're working with European or international organizations, you might be ISO compliant. But when we do these assessments, one of the key things that we find is there's not a lot of focus on who is accountable for these things. Because for a lot of people, it's kind of like a B-bill, like a side job. And that doesn't really work the bigger and bigger you get. So we have a strong opinion, I'll say, about who should be involved and how do you look at your third party risk. So I'll list off kind of who we think which organizationally should be involved. If you have a chief information security officer, that person should definitely be involved, or just a cybersecurity team lead, depending on how you title it. But anybody who you have in a cybersecurity role should definitely be part of this. If you have a risk management office, so like a lot of banks and financial institutions, they have a chief risk officer. Someone from that organization needs to be a part of your team here. Your legal, whether you have a chief legal officer, a general counsel, whatever you call it, but someone from legal needs to be a part of this, as does your procurement. And procurement is obviously, you can get a sense they would be a really pivotal a role because they're looking at all the inbound vendors that want to be working with them, and they're the ones that will identify quickly if they are in or out of compliance. So this is a key team member to have. Your IT staff should be a part of this because if you want to talk about who is going to be, giving out permissions or working with different teammates, your IT team is going to be the one that's going to dictate, well, if we make that change to the network here, it's going to have impacts here, here, and here. Is that worth it to us to work with this vendor or not? And that's the right kind of conversation you want to have. That's what you want to be thinking about. Your executive leadership should also be a part of this. From the top down, everyone needs to understand this isn't somebody else's problem. This is a company problem and a company solution. For a long time, we were fighting this myth that, cybersecurity, that's an IT thing. It's not an IT thing. It's a business thing. It's outside the realm of your basic IT functions. IT is involved, but is not solely responsible for this. So executive leadership from the top down needs to be pushing this and supporting this. If you have a third party risk manager, some people have like a vendor, they might do like vendor questionnaires, or they might call it like a third party risk manager. That's somebody you want to have involved in as well, because if they're involved in your partnerships, you want that person as a part of this conversation. And then finally, any external consultants you might have, if you do business with some partner networks, you want to have the representative at least as a part of that. This is the right kind of a team, and what we recommend typically is having some sort of a basic standing quarterly meeting on the books, report something to probably the CEO or maybe CFO, depending on how your hierarchy works. But we do recommend having a steering committee. These are the right members to have on it, and we feel like that's giving you a good idea of who should be involved. When it comes to basic cybersecurity, not necessarily involving third party, HR is heavily involved. There's onboarding and offboarding processes for employees, for maybe people with privileged network access. You want to have, like that's a typical cybersecurity program thing. Your third party risk, you need a good diverse set of your professionals to be a part of it, because it's going to affect all of your operations, not drastically, but everyone's affected.
Yep. And the key thing is if your vendors aren't compliant, you're not compliant. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. And knowing what you're, yeah, perfect. And knowing what you're compliant with. So, this segues nicely here. So the internal audit business analysis piece, um, we this is what this team does. So the team members I just mentioned, this is basically what they're doing. Conduct audits, identify weaknesses, know what your risks are, and be able to mitigate your vulnerabilities. establish your own standards that you want to maintain for yourself. And then, when you understand what you need to do, what your regulators, what your clients, what your vendors need you to do, then you can decide, here's our baseline. This is just how we go to business, right? This is our day-to-day, how we do things. You over time need to evolve into that. This is part of your weekly conversation. Your impacts of having a cyber risk management program are huge. You want to have contractual safeguards in place, right? This is the type of process that will help create that. You want ongoing monitoring in place. This is the type of activity that helps to create these things. Your training and awareness programs. We all get the phishing and training. Sometimes it's automated. Sometimes we get into a group setting. These are really valuable things that we know people need to have. So this is the type of activity that creates those policies, creates that level of activity. We think these are some of the most important things that a company can do in creating a culture around it.
Yeah, and part of the things that you have to ask yourself as a company is that do you know which top three vendors that will, if they go offline, will impact you? And that's those types of things that we talk about in incident response plan. What do you do when these things happen? We rely on these things, and that's the internal process that you have to kind of go over. And so the other things that we have to talk about too is like the contracts and agreements. Um, Everybody thinks of contracts as pretty much that it's only about pricing. They neglect the areas of like security controls or data protection obligations or timelines for breaches because that's all. It's a team. We're working as a partner when you're working with your vendor. And
Mhm.
if they don't know, you don't know what they're doing, and it's the opening that the hackers are going to go and take advantage of. And so you should. It's like a blueprint for accountability as we talk about it, right? You should know when, like, it should be within 24 to 48 hours, like Kevin said. Like, they have to notify you of what's happening, you know, right to audit, or, when you have something with, like, what is their policy and their framework. And so these should be standard languages across your contracts to make sure that, hey, it's in there, because like legally they got to tell you what's happening. And it's just not about like, they can cancel anytime or this is how much it is. These contracts have to be in there. And so that's where it's important that, when's the last time you looked at the vendor contracts or updated it? Because things change all the time, and we got to
Mhm.
make sure that it's all up to date. And what compliance, do your vendors align with what you're following? What protocols like NIST or whatever it is in your area of business? Are they following that? And so you have to know. And vendors like, when's the last time they did it? Just because they did it one time, are they keeping it? And so that's very important that they do that as part of being a part of your partners.
This
Uh,
is this
Go
this is
ahead.
one of the due diligence piece here. There are several forms out there. There's some called Venminder and shared assessments that you can contract other organizations to do vulnerability, or I'm sorry, vendor onboarding in your sort of in your place, on your behalf rather. Um, having a standard form is good, but it's also misleading at times. Some companies have a SOC 2 Type 2, might be NIST compliant, ISO compliant, high trust compliant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it answers all of the questions that somebody might have on one of these forms. And a lot of the times, the forms that people get for due diligence and onboarding are sort of they're looked at as a little bit of a pain in the butt, right? So they give it to somebody and say, here, fill this out. It might be for a vendor, it could be for insurance, whatever it is. You really do need that committee I talked about. You want that committee looking at the due diligence to understand, is this worth the risk? And I'll share a short story too. We have a client in the financial services space. They're a pretty big company. They work in the mortgage sector. They have a pretty robust vendor management program. We are subject to the same standards that we enforce on them we are one of their vendors and we get these assessments too. So we see what they're doing for their own vendors. There are times when they want us to come in and do an assessment on a vendor they want to work with because there might be some big application that they want to either use as a part of their process, or they want to use a new network piece of equipment, but they want us to do an assessment on that company, which is not an uncommon ask at this point. So when we do that, we start to understand the realities of here's the company that wants to use the product, here's the vendor, and we're in the middle. And we see what each of them says about each other from a on documents and forms, and it doesn't always paint the right picture. A lot of the times we do recommend, yes, you can use a third party like us, but we typically tell you guys just definitely need to talk. Don't just use the forms, because sometimes there's lost in translation is a big piece of what we deal with. Not everyone uses the same terminology, and these forms can be a little confusing. So this is an important process, and I'll let Long talk about it too. I just wanted to share there's some pragmatism there and try to use common sense and don't get too caught up in the terminology. At some point, a conversation might be necessary, especially if you're being told, no, we can't work with you. You're like, hold on, maybe you misinterpreted something.
Yeah, and we're known like as a IT MSP for companies, we get like the form, fill out this form. Like, what do we do here? And it's just you don't know enough, right? There's not. It's just like yeah, you're check marking. Hey, we follow this. We
Hmm.
do this. And but what else is there? Besides that, that's why it's really good to have that committee, like Kevin's saying, because other pair of eyes have to look at to make sure that is this being checked? Is everything being vetted correctly as a team? And it's just not falling on one person. Like I said, like, it's a very common misconception of just like IT will take care of it. Yeah.
And a lot of times people have a certification, right? So it's not even like, it's not valuable. It says, here's our SOC 2 Type 2, or here's our NIST attestation letter. A lot of times that works for people, but just not always. And so, these are not perfect systems, but the idea is improving it over time. And this is still a relatively young process and kind of department to have as a company. It's one thing people don't always give themselves quite enough leeway. Um, but anyway, moving on.
Yeah, no, it's going to take time. This is not going to happen
Yeah.
overnight. Just because you have a checklist doesn't mean anything either. It's part of it. You got to it's a thing that you have to incorporate into the process, and
Mhm.
that's why it's very important. And part of
Agree.
it is understanding. Like our next thing we're talking about is collaboration and data integrity. It's this is essential because it must be secure and traceable. You have to know what's happening. Vendors operate, within the shared ecosystem. So they got to know, like, okay, what data is being accessed when I'm working with this vendor? What changes are being made. So change management is very important. That's happening. Things can't just be because they have access. They can do whatever you want. You know, Responsibility, accountability. Who's doing in? Do you have an action plan? What's happening there? So it's really important, and we recommend adopting certain things that there should always be role-based access when you're using access into systems. Named accounts. It's important because you can't just have a vendor come in and just have a generic name, right? Okay, vendor ABC is going to come in and they have
Mhm.
access to the certain things and who from their company is going in there, right? Like, we want to know who's coming in. That's why named accounts are very important.
Yeah.
Audit trails, right? It's important that when did they go in? What's happening? Anytime there's an incident or something that impacts your business, first thing you go is, okay, what happened? What's the last change? Who was last in there, right? Because then you can roll back or what you're looking for. That's why it's very important to have that documentation and knowing that's happening. You know, so it's communication is key too. If your vendor or you are doing something, there has to be that ongoing communication, having a plan in place. And that's where change management has always been important when it comes time, even for internal changes, external changes, whatever we're doing, it's really important to have that. And in order to do this, it's like you have to understand why is it happening, what is happening, who. Those are the questions that are all part of your change management program. If you don't have one, you should. You know, um,
One
then
thing that I want to just touch on here as well is the data classification program. It's a good example when this is when I said I'd bring back GDPR. It's a good way to think about sort of a keystone element of what a program needs to have. If you have a cyber risk management program in general, you probably have a data classification program. And that means if somebody asks you, let's take the GDPR European privacy law example where you get the accept our cookies and accept our tracking policies now. That all happened because of GDPR and it worked its way into the US. That European law from 2018 worked its way into California, and then the privacy laws ran state to state, and it came from the West Coast across to the East Coast. And that's been happening for a couple of years now. There's probably 15 to 18 states now that have their own privacy laws. And the reason why they're going to continue using them is because they are basically revenue generators. Those privacy laws, violation of them dictates a some kind of a fine, and companies have to pay it. So it actually generates revenue. So they're probably never going to go away at this point. A national privacy law may or may not happen ever based on our, country's ability to agree on what should a privacy law look like. But state to state, they're getting it together. And where all that boils down to is a data classification program means you can identify the data, you know where it's at, you know who has access to it, you know if you can delete it, you know if you can transfer it. There's a lot of aspects of that data that you know what to do, how to do, what to do it with. If you don't have a data classification program and you're working with, you want to work with a new marketing agency, they might have access to your CRM. Their non-compliance with a law versus your compliance with a law means you're now not compliant. Long, you just said that a minute ago. But the reality is your data classification means you have to be able to pinpoint at a moment's notice if an auditor asks you to where and who has access, which policy drives access. These are all the things you need to know. If you aren't enforcing that on your vendor network, that's a big, red flag. So we see that being violated quite a bit. That's a lot of times one of those pragmatic examples where companies get into trouble. And so they need like quick fixes typically. And unfortunately, it's not always a quick fix. If we have to make network changes based on a compliance requirement, that can be a problem because now it disallows access or functionality of the network. And now you're trying to reverse engineer how to do this correctly versus being proactive. And that's really what we want to encourage people to do is thinking about that proactive approach.
Yep, and it falls in line with what we're talking about right now next, auditing and monitoring protocols. Do you have a change management process? And when it comes to this, it's crucial to maintaining the long-term supply chain resilience. You have to identify those things that need enhancements.
Mhm.
Vendor inconsistent performance, weak controls, repeated non-compliance, right? It's those things where you have to get the insight of where the real vulnerabilities lie. It's not like you said, it's not paperwork, right? We just fill in the form. It's about reviewing their activity logs, looking at their patch and update timelines, right? Are they doing that? Because there's always something that's going on and changing needs to make sure it's happening, or assessing their contractual obligations or versus their actual performance. Are they really doing what they're writing, right? Just because it's written down? Yeah.
Long, do you in your travels when with leadership of a lot of your clients, do CEOs or CFOs typically understand what a change management process really means?
They don't. Part of it, when I have to describe to them, is that in order for things not to happen on the fly, they sometimes want things right away. We have to kind of pump the brakes, and we
Mhm.
tell them if you don't plan it and you're just like asking for something and it changes, you don't know what kind of impacts. If you can't explain the impacts, or if you don't know how to roll back something, then you don't have a plan. You can't just do everything on the fly just because this is nice. It's or they hear something they want to make it happen right away. We, as as IT specialists, we go in and go, hey, hold on, what's happening here? What else does it affect if you're doing these things? And that's what we ask our team to do too, to make sure, are you asking the right questions? And they don't understand that sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of what I figured. Didn't mean to ask a leading question, but I kind of
Yeah.
most don't. Yeah,
And that's why it's important to have it. A lot of people don't because it takes time because it's really it's a change of the way you do things inside your environment from every part. Anything that's production should always have a change management in place.
yeah. I will tell you too, I'm the president of, the company here. I'm one of the two co-founders. As we've grown the team over the years, there are things that I now don't have permission to do or get access to on a persistent basis. If I need it, I can ask for it. But, if I try to get into a part of our SharePoint or whatever, I don't have access to it because as the leader of a company, I'm one of the more, targeted folks out there to gain my access to my company. I know that. So the company knows that. So our administrators make sure that between myself and our other leaders, we don't have persistent access to things. And leaders oftentimes think I should have access to everything, but really the truth is the higher up the food chain you go, the least access you should have. The same concept, the theory of least privilege, should also be directed at your vendors. They should have the most minute amount of access possible in order to get the job done. And we think that that's one of the key aspects that makes these programs work well, knowing that you're going to get the minimum amount of access needed, the minimum amount of data transfer needed. Why give out more? There's no reason to do it. And it's not a problem. It's not a question of do I trust my vendors? It's a question of you don't need to give them that. They don't need to bear that responsibility.
Yeah.
So I look at that as a positive approach, a new way of thinking about it.
And that's part of the due diligence of having that checklist and knowing what the questions to ask. What do you need access to, and understanding whatever that API or whatever it is sinking in. Because you can't just go, oh, give them all full rights, right? It's going to work when they get full rights.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it definitely falls into best practices, right? What do you do? We've been kind of going at it, like you should always have the checklist, as
Hmm.
Kevin said. One of the things that you have to have a team, like that's looking at a committee or somebody's that it's overviewing. That's one of the biggest things that we've noticed that people don't realize is it takes the whole team, not just IT, right? Um, Data classification, document and classify the vendors. It's really important to have that, you know. The cybersecurity terms that you need to know, we can, that's one of the things where is it in the contract? Do you understand what's happening there? You know, what pre-onboarding reviews, right? The questions to ask. Because I know I got asked recently, like, hey, I'm about to buy a program. And we're like, okay. Just could like give it to IT, can I buy this? Or a purchasing just goes, oh, how much is it? But you have to ask questions about what are they going into? What do they have access into our system? How do we log in? SSO. There's a lot of things that come into play. And that not just one person can just ask that. That's why it's really important.
Hmm.
Yeah. What other things do you have, Kevin, like when it comes to
Yeah, we have a bit of a checklist, and this is something that if people are interested, we could share it. But a bit of a checklist, the way we think about it. There's there's planning for it, right? And which is you get your team together. You basically you start to enact these things as this is how we're going to go about this. You get your you get your scope together for, okay, does this impact just a division of a company? Does it impact our whole company? So you get your planning and your scope down, identify any laws or contracts that you're being subject to. Then you want to do your own inventory of here's the equipment we use, here's the data centers we have, here's our risk profile, and that requires sometimes a third party to come in and help you figure that out. When we see companies try to like do self-assessments and score themselves, they typically score very high, right? But they're not accurate because there's a lot of bias there. So we see that quite often, and a lot of the times we go back and we'll do an assessment for a company that previously scored themselves, and it's not really, and they're like, yeah, probably, they kind of know. It's like hard to say, well, no, but we think that, what the due diligence and onboarding is the next piece. That's where, once you've got your planning and your scope and you've inventoried your processes and your assets and you have a risk posture or profile in mind, the next real active step is that due diligence and onboarding. So we've already talked about that. I don't want to beat dead horse, but that's when you start to use a security scorecard, or you work with some third party vendor management type company that'll do the surveys for you. The monitoring and management is that internal piece that steering committee can help to dictate how well are you following your own program, and scheduling periodic self-assessments, having some KPIs in mind. Your vendor compliance rate, if you have an incident, what was your response time? If they have an incident, what was their response time? Knowing some of these KPIs will make a big difference. And having a playbook, so knowing that you have an incident response plan is key. We didn't talk too much about that yet, but an incident response plan means who's involved in responding to a breach. You maybe hopefully you have security monitoring and log analysis happening. That way you can actually figure out what happened. If you don't have that, then you're just kind of shooting in the dark. So we think that having an incident response plan, knowing that you've tested it with maybe a tabletop test, you can do this internally. A lot of people ask us to do them for them. however you want to do it, we think that best practice really makes a big difference. Because if you have vendors that should be involved, you'll know it when you're practicing, and you don't want to have to figure it out when you're in a real time active breach. And then there's continuous improvement and reporting, right? Knowing every year, okay, we've done these tests, we've trained these people, we wrote these policies, we have these vendors, we know how many we have, because a lot of times people don't even know. You might think you have 10 or 12 vendors that you work with that you share data. It turns out you might have 30 or 50. And a lot of the times when you start to, do an inventory of all of your vendors, that's when you realize that you know, you didn't analyze them quite effectively. And then starts to look like a big monumental task, but it's not. You just start with the vendors that have the most impact on your business, and then you just pick one at a time, like eating an elephant one bite at a time. That's how you go. Um, but that's kind of the general kind of checklist that we see, and again, we can make this available for folks, but um, that's a process working properly for this.
Yeah, you're building a system of accountability, right? That protects the business long term. Because if you don't know it, that's an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Yeah.
right. Well, we'd like to thank everybody for being here today. Supply chain risk is a complex, but it's manageable. It takes time, and you got to build it with the right process and tools. You know, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and definitely we can continue the conversation either here or just contact us.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for being on here. Thanks Long and Big for working with us on this. This is just no longer an option. This is really something people need to realize. This is just part of your process now, and but it's doable. I don't want people to feel like they fear the unknown. This is doable. It's not something you can't solve for yourselves. Just takes a little bit of planning and a little bit of leadership buy-in, and it can get done.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
We have a question in the chat from Aaron. Who do you go to start the conversation about your cyber posture?
I could take a stab at this
Yeah,
one.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say this, understanding your cyber posture is best done with a third party. Not to like toot our own horn, but this is a lot of what we do for companies that are starting down this path. They want to get some kind of a risk assessment or a network pen test to understand kind of where their risk is and what their vulnerabilities are. Then they can start to realize if suddenly they have a lot of vendors that pop up in their vulnerability section of an assessment or a test, that's when we'll say, okay, these are the ones we've identified as a potential, threat to your business operations. Let's talk about how you can mitigate that. And that's usually the best first step. Those initial assessments are not very expensive. They don't take very long. It's pretty crucial though to use a third party to do it. If you try to do it on your own, again, that bias kicks in and that can be tough to get out of your own way. But that's typically how we recommend you get started.
Yeah, and that's a really good example because even if we're your IT MSP provider, we use a third party to check our work because it's the bias that we're managing your environment, right? We think we're okay, we did this, we did that. We think we're good, but it's always good that we reach out to a third party like Layer 8 to kind of, hey, check our work, make sure the vulnerability is right, make sure the penetration's right. Are we missing anything?
Yeah.
It's very important, even if you have internal or you're using an MSP.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, good question.
All right. Think that's it, right? Well, thank you, everybody.
Yes, indeed. 45 minutes exactly.
All
All
right.
right.
Have a nice weekend.
Thanks, Long and team.
Yep. Thanks,
See you.
Kevin.